The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. The air felt heavier than it should have, thick with murmurs and the occasional shuffle of papers. Everyone's eyes were on her, Charlotte Hale, standing in the center of the room like an uninvited guest at her own reckoning. "Mrs. Hale, you are to leave this courtroom immediately. That is the order of this court," Judge William Carter's voice rang out, sharp and unwavering. The wooden gavel in his grip struck the desk with a crisp, definitive crack. Charlotte held her ground. "Your Honor, I have the right to testify. I have critical evidence." "Enough!" Carter cut her off. His face, stone-like, revealed no room for negotiation. "This is a court of law, not a stage for your personal grievances. You are in violation of courtroom attire regulations. You will be escorted out now." The room buzzed. Whispers flitted through the audience. Eyebrows raised in disbelief. Charlotte looked down at herself. A navy blue suit pressed to perfection. Pumps polished. A pearl necklace resting neatly on her collarbone. Professional? Appropriate? Respectable? Except, apparently, not today. A uniformed officer moved toward her hesitantly. James Foster. The courthouse security officer had been standing at the edge of the room, arms crossed, expression neutral, until now. "Ma'am, please," Foster said, his voice softer than she expected. Charlotte clenched her jaw. This wasn't about attire. This was about silencing her, about making sure her case never saw the light of day. The very company she had worked for, the one that had wrongfully fired her, had far too much at stake if she spoke. And this judge, whether by allegiance, bias, or something darker, was making sure she wouldn't. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides. She had fought too hard to be dismissed this easily. Then, the unexpected. A sharp, electronic chime cut through the heavy atmosphere. The judge's phone was ringing. All eyes turned toward the bench. Carter hesitated, his thick brows pulling together in a frown as he reached for the phone. He glanced at the screen, and something shifted in his face. It was subtle, but Charlotte saw it, a flicker of tension. He answered. "Yes, this is Judge Carter speaking," he said. His voice, which had been so firm moments ago, had lost its edge. A pause, a long, stretching silence. Then, his posture straightened abruptly. He cleared his throat. "Understood," Carter said, his voice clipped. He set the phone down with measured precision, inhaling deeply before shifting his gaze back to Charlotte. "Officer," he said, his voice now oddly restrained, "bring Mrs. Hale back to the stand." Foster stopped mid-step. He looked at the judge, then at Charlotte, and for the first time his rigid professionalism cracked into something resembling confusion. The entire courtroom was silent. Charlotte didn't move. Not yet. Because whatever had just happened, whatever that phone call had been, it had just changed everything. But before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Charlotte sat at her desk, the familiar hum of fluorescent lights overhead, casting a dull glow on the polished surface. The office smelled the same, freshly brewed coffee from the break room, a faint trace of printer ink in the air. It was a quiet morning, the kind where emails trickled in lazily, and the sound of fingers typing filled the space like a soft rhythm. She had started the day like any other, sorting through reports, reviewing performance evaluations. But then something caught her eye. On the screen in front of her, a spreadsheet stared back, numbers lined up in neat, sterile rows. At first glance, it looked like any other set of employee statistics, hiring rates, retention percentages, promotion frequencies. But the pattern was wrong. Her fingers hovered over the mouse as she scrolled through the data again, her pulse quickening. The termination rates for Black employees were alarmingly higher than any other demographic, more than 40% higher. Her stomach twisted. She clicked over to another tab, Promotion History. The numbers were even worse. While white and Asian employees climbed the corporate ladder at a steady pace, Black employees rarely moved beyond entry-level positions. Those who did were consistently passed over for leadership roles. This wasn't a coincidence. Her breath came shallow as she scrolled further. Then, something even more damning, a set of emails buried deep within the company's internal records. She skimmed through the messages, her fingers tightening against the edge of the desk. The language was careful, diplomatic even, but the implications were unmistakable. One email from a senior executive read, "We need to be mindful of cultural fit when considering leadership placements." Another, "Let's focus on promoting candidates who align with the company's long-term vision." She swallowed hard. She knew exactly what that meant. It wasn't about performance. It wasn't about qualifications. It was about something far uglier. Charlotte sat back, exhaling slowly. A cold realization settled in. This company had no intention of fostering diversity beyond a surface-level quota. They were systematically shutting out black employees from career growth, and she had the proof. Her hands moved instinctively. She printed out several pages, watching the documents slide into the tray one by one. Each sheet felt heavier than the last. But just as she reached for the stack, her desk phone rang. She jumped slightly, her heartbeat still racing from what she had just uncovered. For a moment, she debated ignoring it. Then, glancing at the caller ID, she felt a sharp pang of unease. David Langston, Senior Vice President of Human Resources. The timing was too perfect. She picked up. "Charlotte, I need you in conference room B." "Now." Langston's voice was crisp, lacking his usual forced warmth. She hesitated. "What is this about?" "You'll find out when you get here." The line went dead. Charlotte stared at the receiver, her mind whirring. Something about this felt off. The urgency, the lack of explanation, the way he didn't even give her a choice. She glanced back at the papers in her hand. The weight of them was tangible now. This wasn't just an impromptu meeting. This was something else. She took a deep breath, gripping the documents tighter before tucking them into her bag. Then, with one last glance at her screen, she logged out and stood. As she walked down the hallway toward conference room B, a knot tightened in her stomach. She had uncovered something she wasn't supposed to, and now they knew. Charlotte stepped into the conference room, her heels clicking against the polished hardwood floor. The air inside was different, thicker, heavier, as if it had been waiting for her. Three men sat at the long, mahogany table, their gazes sharp and unreadable. There was no welcome, no casual pleasantries, not even a pretense of small talk. No presentation materials, no performance reports. Just a single white envelope placed precisely in the center of the table. David Langston, the Senior Vice President of Human Resources, folded his hands neatly in front of him. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back, his expensive suit pristine as ever. The other two men, one from legal, the other from corporate strategy, sat in silence, their presence more of a formality than necessity. Langston exhaled slowly, almost as if he were preparing for a performance. Then he spoke. "We've been reviewing your recent conduct, Charlotte," he said, voice smooth but firm. "There are some serious concerns." She narrowed her eyes. "Concerns?" "Regarding your access to internal data," he continued, "and unauthorized use of company resources." The words hit her like a slap. She had expected them to play dirty, but not this fast. "Unauthorized," she echoed. "I was doing my job." Langston leaned back, feigning disappointment. "Is that what you call printing confidential documents without approval?" Charlotte stiffened. They knew. She thought back to that morning, the way she had hurriedly grabbed the printed pages, the lingering unease she felt as she left her desk. The cameras. They had seen everything. Langston tilted his head, studying her reaction. "We can approach this in two ways," he said, tapping his fingers lightly against the table. "One is simple. You sign this." He slid the envelope toward her. She didn't move. Inside, she already knew, was a resignation letter. Charlotte crossed her arms. "And if I don't?" Langston sighed as if he had been hoping she wouldn't ask that question. Then he nodded to one of the other men. "Her access is already revoked?" "Yes," came the response. Charlotte felt a chill crawl up her spine. Her email, gone. Her company credentials, deactivated. The files on her laptop, they had already seized it. The walls of control, carefully built around her, were closing in fast. Langston reached for the envelope and pulled out another document, a second stack of papers. "If you'd rather not resign, we can proceed with a formal investigation," he said, sliding it toward her. "A breach of data policies, violation of confidentiality agreements." A legal nightmare. One designed to make sure she'd never work in this industry again. Charlotte's jaw clenched. So that's the game? You paint me as the problem, make me disappear quietly, and none of this ever comes out? Langston gave a slow, measured smile. That depends entirely on you. She glanced down at the paper. If she signed, she'd walk away with a severance package, her name intact but her silence purchased. If she refused, they'd bury her in lawsuits before she ever had a chance to expose them. Her fingers curled into fists. I'm not signing anything, she said. The room grew colder. Langston exchanged a glance with the legal representative, then slid yet another document forward. A non-disclosure agreement. This, Langston said, is a different offer. Walk away with dignity and a check for $200,000. Silence stretched between them. Charlotte felt her heartbeat in her throat. $200,000. More money than she'd ever had in one place. Enough to cover her bills for years. Enough to start over. But it was also enough to ensure that no one would ever hear the truth. Her eyes flickered back to Langston. What if I say no? He smiled again, but this time it was sharper, less patient. You won't like the alternative. Charlotte's pulse pounded in her ears. She wasn't just fighting for her job anymore. She was fighting to keep her voice, and she was running out of time. Charlotte sat frozen, the silence in the room stretching unbearably. The papers in front of her remained untouched, the words stamped on them carrying more weight than any contract she had ever seen. David Langston leaned back in his chair, his eyes studying her, waiting for the inevitable. He had seen this scenario play out before. An employee caught in a no-win situation, forced to choose between dignity and survival. Charlotte's fingers twitched against the armrest. Every rational part of her brain screamed at her to take the deal. Sign the paper. Walk away. She could rebuild her life elsewhere, far away from the corporate politics and the ruthless power plays. But then she thought of the spreadsheet, the emails, the conversations behind closed doors that weren't meant to see the light of day, and she knew she couldn't. Charlotte exhaled, slow and steady, before lifting her eyes to Langston's. I'm not signing anything. The air in the room shifted. The smug expression on Langston's face faded, replaced by something colder. The other men exchanged brief glances, silent communication passing between them. Langston sighed, feigning disappointment. That's unfortunate. He signaled to the man on his right, who promptly reached into a folder and retrieved another set of documents. Langston placed them neatly in front of her, tapping his fingers on the cover page. This is the formal termination notice, he said smoothly, effective immediately. Charlotte's stomach tightened. You'll be escorted out of the building, he continued. Your access to all company systems has already been revoked. Your work email, files, everything, gone. We'll issue an internal statement that you left for personal reasons. Of course, if you attempt to reach out to any employees regarding this matter, there will be consequences. Charlotte swallowed, her mind racing. So that's it, she said. I expose something you don't want out in the open, and I just disappear. Langston's smile was slow and deliberate. That's how the world works, Mrs. Hale. Her jaw clenched, but she didn't respond. There was no point. She stood keeping her back straight, even as her heart pounded against her ribs. If this was their play, she would have to make hers. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the conference room. The moment she stepped into the hallway, 2 security guards were already waiting. Ms. Hale, please come with us, one of them said, his tone polite but firm. Charlotte didn't resist. There was no point in causing a scene, not yet. She let them lead her through the office, past rows of employees who barely lifted their heads. Some glanced up, their eyes darting away quickly, as if afraid to acknowledge what was happening. By the time she reached the front doors, her employee badge had already been deactivated. The guards didn't even let her return to her desk. And just like that, it was over. She stepped outside, the cold air hitting her like a slap. She was no longer an employee of the company she had once been proud to work for. She had lost everything. But as she walked down the steps, one hand gripping the strap of her bag, she reminded herself. She still had the most important thing. The documents she had printed that morning were tucked safely inside. The proof. They had taken away her job, her reputation, her stability, But they hadn't taken away her voice. She wasn't done yet. Charlotte pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the name she was looking for. Olivia Bennett, a civil rights attorney with a reputation for taking on impossible cases. She hit dial. Charlotte! Olivia's voice came through the line, sharp and alert. I need your help, Charlotte said, her voice steady. I'm taking them to court. There was a pause. Then Olivia's voice came firm and clear. If we do this, they'll come after you with everything they have. Are you ready for that? Charlotte closed her eyes for a brief moment, then exhaled. They already took everything from me, she said. Now it's my turn. And with that, the real fight began. 2 weeks had passed since Charlotte filed her lawsuit. In that time, she had begun to understand the weight of what she was up against. At first, there was nothing, just silence, as if the company was ignoring her entirely. But she knew better. They were preparing. And when they struck hard. A headline flashed across her phone screen as she sat at her small kitchen table, scrolling through the morning news. Former HR executive fired for breach of company ethics. Lawsuit nothing more than a personal vendetta. Charlotte felt her stomach tighten. She tapped on the article, her eyes skimming the carefully crafted narrative. The company had hired Wallace & Stern, one of the most powerful corporate law firms in New York. Their official statement was polished, deliberate, painting her as a disgruntled former employee who had been caught violating company policies. According to them, she had accessed restricted files without permission, compromised confidential data, and had been terminated for cause. Not a word about the discrimination. Not a single mention of the evidence she had uncovered. Just an attempt to make her look like a liar. She exhaled slowly, setting her phone down before clicking on her laptop. Social media was even worse. People who had never met her, never worked with her, suddenly had opinions. Just another ex-employee trying to milk the system. If she was so good at her job, why was she fired in the first place? This is why corporations hesitate to promote diversity. People just turn around and cry discrimination when things don't go their way. Charlotte clenched her jaw, her hands balling into fists. She had expected this, knew they would try to destroy her credibility. But seeing it unfold in real time, watching strangers pick apart her career, her motives, her integrity, it was harder than she'd imagined. Her phone rang. She didn't even check the caller ID before answering. Charlotte, her mother's voice came through, soft but heavy. I saw the news. Charlotte closed her eyes, bracing herself. Are you sure this is worth it? Her mother continued. Fighting them? They have too much power. You know how these things end. Charlotte swallowed, trying to keep her voice steady. So what? I should just let them get away with it. I'm saying you need to think about your future. There was a pause. They're dragging your name through the mud. Is that really worth it? Charlotte sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. She understood where her mother was coming from. The older generation had seen too many battles like this, fought and lost. They had learned to survive by choosing their fights carefully, but Charlotte had already made her choice. I can't walk away, she said finally. Not from this. Her mother was silent for a long moment before letting out a quiet sigh. I just don't want to see you hurt, she murmured. Then softer, you know how this world works. Charlotte nodded, even though her mother couldn't see her. I know. They hung up and Charlotte sat in the silence of her apartment, staring blankly at the screen. Doubt crept in, whispering in the back of her mind. What if I can't win? What if they bury me in lawsuits and counterclaims? What if I end up worse off than before? Then, as if on cue, her email pinged, a message from an unknown sender. She clicked it open cautiously. I saw what they did to you. It happened to me, too. Charlotte's heart rate picked up. They forced me out when I asked for a promotion, said I wasn't a cultural fit. I have emails, records, but I'm scared to come forward. A former employee, someone who had suffered the same fate. Charlotte's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She had to reach out. She had to speak to him. But before she could even draft a response, another email popped up. Delivery failure notification. She frowned, refreshing the page. But the email was gone, completely wiped from her inbox. as if it had never been there. Her stomach twisted. She dialed Olivia. "They got to him," she said the moment her lawyer picked up. Olivia was silent for a moment, then she exhaled, long and slow. "This is how they operate," Olivia said. "They threaten, intimidate, make people disappear. They know that without witnesses, it's just your word against theirs." Charlotte closed her eyes, gripping the edge of the desk. "They think they can scare me off," she said quietly. "Can they?" Olivia asked. Charlotte took a deep breath. "They're going to wish they had." Charlotte sat at her small wooden desk, the glow of her laptop screen illuminating the dimly lit apartment. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, but she wasn't tired. Not anymore. Sleep had become a luxury she couldn't afford. Emails, case files, press releases. Her world was now consumed by paperwork and legal battles. But through all of it, there was one thing she couldn't ignore: the feeling of being watched. She had first noticed it earlier that evening. A shadow lingering too long across the street, a figure shifting when she moved. The rational part of her mind told her she was imagining things. But another part, the part that had seen powerful people do terrible things to protect their secrets, knew better. A sharp knock against the door made her jolt. Her breath hitched. She wasn't expecting anyone. Slowly she rose from her chair, her bare feet silent against the hardwood floor. She approached the door with cautious steps, peering through the peephole. Nothing. Just the dimly lit hallway of her Brooklyn apartment complex. She hesitated before unlocking the door, cracking it open just enough to see outside. And there it was. A single envelope slipped halfway under the door. She bent down, heart pounding, and picked it up. The paper felt rough beneath her fingertips, the kind that hadn't come from any store-bought printer. A faint smell of cigarette smoke clung to it. She flipped it open, her pulse spiking as her eyes locked onto the words scrawled in jagged, uneven handwriting. "Stop before it's too late." Her stomach twisted. No signature, no return address, just a warning. Charlotte let out a shaky breath, her fingers tightening around the paper. So this was how they wanted to play it. She forced herself to swallow the creeping fear and tossed the note onto the table. She wouldn't let them see her shake. But deep inside, she knew. They were getting desperate. The next morning, Charlotte stood in line at the corner coffee shop, her mind still clouded by last night's message. She had barely slept, but she refused to let exhaustion slow her down. When it was her turn to pay, she reached into her bag for her card, only to hear the cashier clear his throat awkwardly. "Uh, it's declined," he said, glancing at the screen. Charlotte frowned. "That can't be right. Try again." Another failed transaction. A sinking feeling settled in her stomach. She pulled out her phone and checked her banking app. A bright red notification blinked back at her. "Account restricted due to security concerns. Please contact customer service." Her jaw tightened. This wasn't a mistake. Less than 48 hours ago, she had rejected a settlement offer. Now suddenly her finances were frozen. She knew exactly who was behind it. Gritting her teeth, she shoved her phone back into her pocket and walked out of the cafe, her coffee forgotten. They weren't just trying to scare her anymore. They were trying to cut her off. That evening, the sense of unease followed her home. As she made her way up the narrow staircase to her apartment, she paused on the second-floor landing. Something felt off. She turned her head slightly, scanning the space behind her. A man stood at the bottom of the stairs, half hidden in shadow. Dressed in dark clothes, his hands stuffed into his pockets, he wasn't looking directly at her. But she knew. He wasn't just another neighbor. Charlotte tightened her grip on her keys, heart hammering. She forced herself to walk the rest of the way to her door without breaking into a run. Once inside, she locked the door immediately, throwing the deadbolt into place. She exhaled, pressing her back against the wood. They were watching her. Later that night, exhaustion finally overtook her. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, forcing herself to believe she was safe for now, until she heard it, a faint creak. Charlotte sat up instantly, her breath catching. Another sound, from the kitchen. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she reached for her phone, gripping it so tightly her fingers ached. Summoning every ounce of courage, she slipped out of bed, moving as quietly as possible. The kitchen was dark. The only source of light came from the faint glow of the city through the window. She stepped forward cautiously, then stopped cold. The window. It was open. She knew she had locked it. Her skin prickled. She backed away, her eyes darting around the room. Nothing was missing, nothing had been stolen, but her desk drawers had been opened. Her case files, papers that had been neatly stacked the day before, were scattered across the floor. Someone had been in her apartment. Charlotte's fingers trembled as she reached for her phone and dialed Olivia. The call barely rang twice before her lawyer picked up. "Charlotte?" Olivia's voice was sharp, immediately sensing something was wrong. "They were here," Charlotte whispered. "Someone was inside my apartment." Silence. Then Olivia's voice turned steely. "You need to leave. Now." Charlotte swallowed, her throat dry. "I'm not running," she said, forcing steel into her voice. "Charlotte, listen to me." "No," she cut her off. "If I leave now, they win. They want me to be scared. They want me to disappear." She exhaled sharply. "I won't give them what they want." Another pause. Then Olivia let out a slow breath. "Then we need to fight back," she said. Charlotte nodded, gripping her phone tighter. "They came for me in the dark," she murmured. "Next time, I'll be ready." Charlotte sat at her kitchen table, staring at the email on her laptop screen. The subject line was simple, almost unremarkable. "I know the truth." But the words inside carried a weight that made her pulse quicken. "I know what's happening. I have proof." There was no unnecessary introduction, no filler, just a straightforward declaration, followed by a name she didn't recognize at first. Daniel Whitmore. She frowned, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She clicked on the name, searching for anything that would jog her memory. Then it hit her. Whitmore had been a hiring director at the company before suddenly leaving last year. No one had questioned it at the time. People came and went, but now his departure felt more like an escape. The email continued. "I need to be careful. We should meet in person. There's a cafe in Queens off 37th Avenue. Tomorrow at noon. I'll be in the back booth. No phones, no recordings. I'll explain everything then." Charlotte exhaled, running a hand through her hair. This could be a setup, a trap, but if it wasn't, it was exactly what she needed. The next day, Charlotte took a seat at the small, dimly lit cafe in Queens. It wasn't the kind of place where people lingered. It was old, quiet, the kind of spot you'd pass 100 times without noticing. Perfect for a secret meeting. A man sat in the back booth, his head slightly lowered, a plain ceramic mug cradled between his hands. His hair was graying at the edges, his posture slightly hunched, as if he were carrying something heavier than just his own body. Charlotte approached cautiously. "Whitmore?" His head lifted immediately. His eyes, deep-set and sharp, darted around the cafe before settling on her. He gestured to the seat across from him. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, voice low. Charlotte slid into the booth, keeping her movements measured. "You said you had proof. Let's talk about that." Whitmore took a sip of his coffee before leaning in slightly. "I worked at the company for over a decade. I was in charge of recruitment and internal hiring reviews, and I saw everything." Charlotte waited, letting the silence between them stretch. He exhaled, rubbing his temple. "They have an unspoken rule. Keep diversity hires at entry-level positions, make it look like they're doing the right thing, but make sure they never move up. Promotions? Those go to people who fit the company culture." The phrase made Charlotte's stomach turn. She had read those same words in the email she uncovered. Whitmore continued. "There were guidelines, unwritten but enforced. I fought it, tried to advocate for the right people, but every time I recommended a black employee for a management role, it was the same story." His voice grew tighter. "They're not ready yet. We need more time to see leadership qualities. Let's reassess in a year." But that year never came. Charlotte swallowed, nodding. "I saw the numbers, the hiring patterns, but without a witness, it's all just data." Whitmore's lips pressed into a thin line. He reached into his coat pocket and slid a folded envelope across the table. "Not just data anymore." Charlotte hesitated before picking it up, unfolding the papers inside. Her breath caught as she scanned the documents. Emails, hiring recommendations, rejected promotions with vague reasons. But more importantly, messages that had supposedly been erased from the company's internal system. Charlotte's head snapped up. How did you get these? Whitmore sighed. Before I left, I started pulling records. I knew what they were doing wasn't just wrong, it was illegal. They thought deleting the emails would cover their tracks, but I backed everything up. Her fingers tightened around the papers. This was the kind of evidence that could change everything. But she wasn't the only one who understood that. Why now, she asked, searching his expression. You left over a year ago. Why are you coming forward now? Whitmore hesitated, then shook his head. Because I was a coward, he admitted. I told myself it wasn't my fight. I took the severance. I signed their NDA, and I walked away. But when I saw what they did to you, how they're trying to destroy you for telling the truth, I realized I couldn't stay silent. His voice lowered further. They will come after me for this, Charlotte. I know it. But I can't live with myself knowing I stood by and let it happen again. Charlotte felt the weight of his words settle over her. She could use him as a key witness. His testimony would strengthen her case in court, but it would also put a target on his back. She took a deep breath. If you go public, they won't just go after you legally. They'll make sure you never work again. You're prepared for that? Whitmore gave a hollow laugh. They already made sure of that when they forced me out. Charlotte studied him for a long moment. This was it, a man willing to risk everything to tell the truth. The question now was, could she protect him? She folded the documents carefully, tucking them into her bag. They won't let this slide, she said, her voice steady. I know, he replied. Charlotte exhaled, gripping her coffee cup as if it could ground her. This fight had just escalated. Daniel had agreed to testify. That alone was enough to send ripples through the entire case. With his insider knowledge and the evidence he provided, Charlotte and Olivia knew they had something powerful, something the company couldn't ignore. They spent days preparing. Olivia meticulously built the legal framework, connecting Daniel's records to Charlotte's findings. The case was stronger than ever, but both women knew one undeniable truth. The moment Daniel's name became public, the company would come after him. And they did. The first sign came in the form of a letter. Daniel called Charlotte early in the morning, his voice tight. I got something in the mail. No return address. Charlotte's stomach clenched. What does it say? A pause, then. It says I should reconsider my choices before I destroy my life. She gripped her phone tighter. It's a scare tactic. They're trying to make you back down. Daniel exhaled sharply. It worked, because I am scared. She was about to respond when another call came through. Olivia. I need you to see something, Olivia said, urgency lacing her tone. Check the news. Charlotte pulled up her laptop, her heart racing as she scrolled through the headlines. Former hiring executive Daniel Whitmore accused of professional misconduct. She clicked on the article, her breath catching as she read. Anonymous complaints, allegations that Daniel had a history of making unfounded claims against leadership decisions. No official lawsuits, but enough whispers to stain his credibility. This is a hit piece, Charlotte murmured, feeling her pulse in her throat. Of course it is, Olivia replied. It's too well timed to be a coincidence. They're tearing him down before he ever steps foot in court. Charlotte clenched her jaw. We knew they'd do this. We just didn't know how fast. But it wasn't over. That evening, Daniel called again. They froze my bank accounts. Charlotte nearly dropped her phone. What? They flagged them for suspicious activity. I can't access my money. Her mind reeled. It was happening all over again. First her, now him. The company was playing the same game, cutting off resources, forcing isolation. Daniel's voice was strained. And that's not even the worst part. My company just fired me. Charlotte felt an icy chill run through her. But you don't even work for them anymore. Yeah, well, my current employer got a call from someone who made sure they knew I was damaging my former company's reputation. He let out a bitter laugh. They didn't want the trouble. Charlotte gripped the table, anger burning in her chest. We can fight this. Olivia can... I don't think you get it, Daniel interrupted. They're not just fighting me in court. They're erasing me. That night, the final blow landed. Daniel called again, this time just past midnight. His voice was hoarse, shaking. They broke into my house. Charlotte's breath caught. Are you hurt? No, I wasn't home, he said quickly. But my office, my laptop, my files, they took everything. She shut her eyes, gripping her phone. Call the police. And say what? Daniel let out a hollow chuckle. That $1 billion company is sending people to intimidate me? They'll call it a burglary and move on. Silence hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Then he said what she had feared most. I can't do this anymore, Charlotte. Her heart clenched. Daniel, don't. They won. His voice cracked. They've taken my money, my reputation, my job. What else is left? You're still here, she said desperately, and your testimony. I won't make it to testify. Charlotte swallowed hard. Please, just give it time. We can. I need to protect what little I have left, Daniel whispered. I can't keep going. And then the line went dead. Charlotte sat in the dark, staring at her phone. She had known the risks, knew this wasn't just a legal battle, it was a war. But for the first time, she realized something painful. Not everyone could fight it the way she could. Charlotte sat at her desk, staring at the blank screen of her laptop. Daniel was gone. Not physically, but in every way that mattered to the case. He had done what anyone in his position would. He protected himself, and she couldn't blame him for that. But now she was alone again. The company had won this round, stripping her of the one insider who could confirm everything. They must have thought she'd fold, that without Daniel's testimony, she'd see the writing on the wall and walk away. They were wrong. If they wanted to silence her behind closed doors, she would take the fight into the light. You're sure about this? Olivia's voice was calm but laced with concern. Charlotte nodded, gripping the coffee cup in front of her. They were seated in a quiet diner in Manhattan, the kind of place where no one paid attention to conversations at the next table. This was never just about Daniel, Charlotte said. It's about every person they pushed out, every career they destroyed. If we can't win in the dark, we take it to the public. Olivia exhaled, stirring her tea. I know someone at the Times, Marcus Reynolds. He's not just a journalist, he's an investigator. He doesn't write unless he knows he can back it up. Charlotte leaned in. Do you trust him? Olivia considered for a moment. I trust that he hates corporate corruption, and he's not afraid to piss off powerful people. That was enough. The meeting with Marcus Reynolds took place in a small office above a bookstore in the East Village. The journalist was in his late 40s, dressed in a faded denim shirt with a pen tucked behind his ear. His desk was buried under stacks of papers, old case files, and a half-empty coffee cup with "Press," because someone has to tell the truth, written on the side. Your case is big, he said, clicking his pen as he skimmed the documents Charlotte had brought. But you're going up against a monster. They'll fight this harder than any lawsuit you can imagine. Charlotte met his gaze. I know. He tapped the papers in front of him. This isn't enough. If I run a story, I need more than numbers, more than accusations. I need names, other employees, people who saw it firsthand. Charlotte's stomach tightened. That's the problem. They're scared. They've seen what happened to Daniel. Marcus leaned back, thoughtful. Then we need to give them a reason not to be. The article hit the front page of the New York Times a week later. The hidden cost of corporate success, how one company silences diversity. Marcus had done what he did best. He took Charlotte's evidence and made it undeniable. He outlined the statistical disparities, the hiring records, the unexplained termination rates. But most importantly, he did what Charlotte couldn't do alone. He found people willing to talk. Anonymous employees. Former managers who had been pressured into rejecting qualified Black candidates for leadership positions. A secretary who had overheard a chilling boardroom conversation about cultural fit. It was all there, laid out in black and white. Then the world caught on. The article exploded across social media. #JusticeForCharlotte started trending within hours. People shared their own experiences with corporate discrimination. Employees from other companies began speaking out. And then, the moment Charlotte hadn't expected, Washington took notice. The next day, the White House press secretary was asked about the case in a briefing. We take issues of workplace discrimination very seriously, she said. We are monitoring the situation closely. Charlotte stared at the television screen in disbelief. This was bigger than her now. That night, she sat across from Olivia in her apartment, the glow of the laptop screen illuminating their faces. You did it, Olivia said. You took back control. Charlotte wanted to believe that, but deep down she knew the company wouldn't let this go unanswered. They were powerful, and now they were desperate. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be subtle. Charlotte had expected retaliation. The company had too much at stake to let her win easily, but she had underestimated just how far they were willing to go. It started subtly, whispers, online comments questioning her motives. Then it escalated. The first blow came in the form of a video leak. At first glance, it looked real. Charlotte sitting across from a corporate representative, discussing numbers, settlements, and her case. The clip was short, edited carefully, cutting off just before the full context was clear. But what the world saw was damning. I need to make sure I get what I deserve out of this, her voice echoed through the recording. The media jumped on it immediately. Headlines blared across news sites. Was it about justice or money? Charlotte Hale's true intentions revealed. Talk shows dissected it, panelists debating whether she was a whistleblower or an opportunist. Social media erupted into chaos. The same people who had supported her now hesitated. This doesn't look good. I wanted to believe her, but maybe the company was right? Just another disgruntled employee trying to get a payday. Charlotte watched in horror as her credibility unraveled in real time. Then came the financial leaks. Suddenly, her private transactions, her mortgage payments, her bank account history, even a personal loan she had taken years ago, were plastered across the internet. The media twisted it, suggesting she had financial motives for bringing down the company. It didn't matter that none of it was illegal. The damage was already done. Her inbox flooded with messages, some from old colleagues expressing disappointment, others from complete strangers, hurling insults. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. You should have stayed quiet. Look at you now. The worst blow landed 2 days later. Someone had fabricated text messages between her and an executive from a rival company. Screenshots spread across the news, making it look as though Charlotte had conspired to destroy her former employer for personal gain. She stared at the messages in disbelief. They looked real, her name, her number, but she had never sent them. The media took the bait instantly. Charlotte Hale's corporate ties exposed. Was this a planned attack? A former supporter turned critic tweeted, "I defended her. Now I feel like a fool." Her phone rang. It was her mother. Charlotte answered, her voice strained. "Mom, you know this isn't—" Her mother's voice was hesitant. "People are talking, Charlotte. I don't want to see you get hurt more than you already have." Charlotte swallowed hard. "So you believe them?" A pause. "I don't know what to believe anymore." The line went dead. Charlotte sat motionless, the phone still in her hand. Olivia arrived at her apartment that night, her face tense, her usual lawyerly calm shaken. She tossed a stack of printed articles onto the coffee table. "We have a problem," Olivia said. Charlotte barely glanced at them. "I know." "No, Charlotte, you don't," Olivia said, her voice sharper than usual. "This isn't just about social media noise. This is strategic character assassination. They're not just discrediting you, they're erasing your case." Charlotte pressed her fingers to her temples. "So what do we do?" Olivia exhaled. "We fight back. But first, you have to make a choice. Do you want to clean up your image, or do you want to go on the offensive?" Charlotte's pulse steadied. They wanted her to retreat, to disappear under the weight of their attacks. But she wasn't done yet. She met Olivia's gaze. "I'm going to make them regret ever coming after me." Charlotte sat in the dim glow of her apartment, scrolling through the flood of online articles, still dissecting her so-called scandal. Her name had become synonymous with controversy, twisted into something unrecognizable. Every news anchor, every social media pundit had an opinion on her integrity. She had lost control of the narrative, and that's exactly what the company wanted. But then, just as the wall seemed to be closing in, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She hesitated before answering. Charlotte Hale. A voice she hadn't heard in weeks spoke on the other end. "You need to see something. James Foster." An hour later, she met him in the parking lot of a quiet diner on the outskirts of the city. James leaned against his car, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Charlotte approached cautiously. "You work security at the courthouse, not the corporate world. Why are you calling me? James exhaled, looking around as if making sure no one was listening. Because I know what they did to you, and I know they're guilty. Charlotte's heart skipped a beat. What are you talking about? He pulled out a flash drive from his pocket and held it up. I worked for them years ago. Security detail at corporate headquarters. Before I left, I kept something I wasn't supposed to. His eyes locked onto hers. I've been following your case, and if you really want to take them down, this is how you do it. Charlotte's fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the drive. What's on it? She asked. James met her gaze. A recording. From a closed-door executive meeting. It proves everything. Back at Olivia's office, Charlotte and her lawyer sat in front of a laptop as the video loaded. The grainy footage showed a corporate boardroom, men in suits seated around a large mahogany table. The CEO sat at the head, his voice unmistakable. This lawsuit cannot go to trial, he said. If it does, we will not only lose, we will be exposed. Another executive chimed in. Then we bury her. We discredit her. We make sure she can't walk away from this without looking like a fraud. The conversation continued, detailing how they manipulated internal reports, erased incriminating emails, and planted false accusations against Charlotte. It was all there. Undeniable. Charlotte leaned back, hands gripping the sides of the chair. Olivia's face was pale, her mouth set in a hard line. This is it, Olivia said. This isn't just unethical. This is criminal. Charlotte exhaled sharply, the weight of the moment sinking in. She had spent months clawing for the truth, fighting to be heard. And now in her hands was the one thing they couldn't twist or manipulate. She wasn't going to let them silence her anymore. Within hours, the video, along with a leaked email confirming the CEO's direct involvement in discriminatory policies, was uploaded to every major social media platform. It spread like wildfire. The headlines changed overnight. Bombshell recording exposes corporate cover-up. Leaked video proves discrimination was company policy. Charlotte watched as the tide shifted. The same media outlets that had questioned her were now running breaking reports on the evidence. The company's stock plummeted, shareholders demanded answers, and calls for federal investigations flooded in. This wasn't just a lawsuit anymore. This was a reckoning. That night, Olivia called with an update. The board is panicking, she said. They're scrambling. We might be looking at a settlement that forces them to change policy across the entire corporation. Charlotte should have felt relief, but instead, she only felt resolve. They're not going to go down quietly, she murmured, and she was right. Because just as she was about to hang up, another message came through, a simple, ominous text from an unknown number. You have no idea what you've started. Charlotte stared at the screen, gripping the phone tightly. The company was cornered, and desperate enemies were always the most dangerous. Charlotte sat in the back of the courthouse, gripping the armrest of her chair as the courtroom filled with reporters, attorneys, and spectators. The air was thick with anticipation. This wasn't just another corporate lawsuit. This was a spectacle, a showdown between an ordinary woman and a billion-dollar company that had spent years burying people like her. Cameras flashed as the door swung open, and the CEO of the company strode in, flanked by a team of high-priced attorneys. He didn't look nervous. He looked annoyed, like this entire trial was an inconvenience, something he expected to be over soon. But Charlotte wasn't intimidated. She had come too far to back down now. The proceedings began with the company's attorneys launching their first attack. The so-called evidence presented by Ms. Hale is unreliable, their lead counsel argued, his voice smooth, polished. The video in question could have been manipulated. In today's world, deepfakes are more convincing than ever. Charlotte felt a flicker of rage. They were still trying to twist the truth. Olivia rose from her seat. The footage is authentic, she countered firmly, and we have a witness who can verify it. The room stirred as James Foster was called to the stand. He adjusted his suit jacket, his face steady as he took his oath. Mr. Foster, Olivia began, can you confirm where this footage came from? James nodded. I worked security for the company. This video was pulled directly from their own internal surveillance system. I kept a copy because I knew something wasn't right. The opposing lawyer stood. But you no longer work for the company. How can we trust you're not just a disgruntled former employee? James met his gaze head on. Because the truth doesn't need my loyalty. It just needs to be seen. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The CEO was called to testify. He walked to the stand adjusting his tie, his face unreadable. Mr. Calloway, Olivia said, addressing him by name, you are the chief executive of this company. Are you aware of the hiring discrimination practices outlined in the leaked emails? The CEO exhaled through his nose, then shook his head. Those emails do not reflect the company's official policies. So you're denying that Black employees were disproportionately denied promotions? I'm saying that any discrepancies were the result of individual decisions by managers, not corporate policy. Olivia didn't flinch. Then how do you explain this? She held up another document, an internal memo signed by Calloway himself, detailing a strategy to maintain cultural alignment in leadership positions. The courtroom went silent. Calloway's jaw tightened. His attorneys whispered furiously among themselves. He had just been cornered, and then, predictably, he shifted the blame. That memo was drafted by my subordinates, he said. I never signed off on its implementation. It was the ultimate corporate defense. When exposed, throw someone else under the bus. Finally, it was Charlotte's turn to take the stand. She walked up slowly, her heels clicking against the floor. Taking a steadying breath, she turned toward the jury. For years, I believed in that company, she began. I worked hard, followed the rules, and thought if I just did my job well enough, I'd be given a fair shot. But I was wrong. She glanced toward Calloway, his expression unreadable. When I saw the hiring data, I realized it wasn't just me. There were hundreds of employees like me, passed over, dismissed, and pushed out. And when I tried to expose it, I was punished for speaking the truth. The jury was listening. She could feel it. This case is not just about me, she continued. It's about a system that tells people like me we're not good enough, no matter how hard we work, that we don't belong at the top. But today you get to decide if that system is allowed to continue unchecked. Her voice didn't waver. When you make your decision, I ask you to think about what it means, not just for me, but for everybody who has been told to sit down and be quiet. She stepped down, her heart pounding. The judge looked toward the jury. We will reconvene tomorrow for the verdict. As Charlotte walked back to her seat, she felt the weight of the moment settle over her. This was it. The company had spent years controlling the narrative. Tomorrow they wouldn't have that power anymore. The courtroom was silent. Not the kind of silence that felt calm, but the heavy, suffocating kind. The kind that made people hold their breath, their muscles tensed, waiting for what came next. Charlotte sat rigid in her chair, her fingers pressing into the smooth wood of the table in front of her. Olivia was beside her, still as a statue, her gaze fixed forward. Across the room, the CEO sat with his team of attorneys, his expression unreadable, though the tightness in his jaw betrayed the tension he was trying to mask. The judge, Thaddeus Carter, a man in his 60s with silver hair and a reputation for being fair but unforgiving, looked over at the jury. Has the jury reached a verdict? A woman in a navy blue suit stood, the foreperson. We have, Your Honor. The courtroom collectively inhaled. Charlotte forced herself to stay still, to not let her emotions take control. She had prepared for this. She had told herself over and over again, whatever the decision was, she had done everything she could. The foreperson cleared her throat. In the case of Charlotte Hale versus Bridgewell and Company, on the charge of unlawful discrimination in hiring and employment practices, we find the defendant guilty. The words hit Charlotte like a wave. Somewhere behind her, someone let out an audible gasp. The foreperson continued, her voice steady. On the charge of reputational harm and defamation, we find the defendant guilty. A murmur rippled through the crowd. A journalist in the gallery scrambled to write down notes. Cameras clicked from the press section. Judge Carter nodded. And the damages? The foreperson glanced down at the paper in her hand. We recommend compensatory damages of $35 million and punitive damages of $75 million. A sharp intake of breath came from the defendant's table. One of the attorneys shifted uncomfortably. Charlotte didn't move. She felt numb, as if her body hadn't caught up with the gravity of what had just happened. It was over. She had won. The aftermath was swift and brutal. That afternoon, the company's stock value plummeted. Investors panicked, dumping shares at a rate so rapid that trading had to be temporarily halted. By the evening, financial analysts were already speculating whether the corporation could survive the reputational damage. By the end of the week, several senior executives resigned, each issuing vague statements about stepping away to focus on new opportunities. And then came the real blow. The Department of Justice announced a formal investigation into Bridgewell and Company. Allegations of deeper corruption, potential fraud, and unethical employment practices meant that the victory in the courtroom was just the beginning of their downfall. The company wasn't just losing a lawsuit, it was unraveling. Charlotte stood outside the courthouse, the cool autumn air brushing against her skin. A crowd had gathered. Activists, former employees, strangers who had followed her story. They cheered as she stepped onto the steps, cameras flashing, microphones thrust toward her. "Charlotte, how do you feel? Do you have a statement? What do you say to the people who doubted you?" She exhaled, gripping the railing for a brief moment before turning to face them. "I didn't do this for myself," she said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind around her. "I did this because no one should have to fight this hard just to be treated fairly." The crowd erupted into applause, but Charlotte barely registered it, because deep inside she knew something that no headline would ever capture. This wasn't a victory, it was just the beginning. Because for every company that got caught, there were dozens more still getting away with it. And that meant the fight wasn't over. Not yet. Charlotte stepped out of the courthouse into the crisp afternoon air. The cheers of the crowd washed over her, a mixture of celebration and defiance. Flashing cameras followed her every move, reporters shouting questions, desperate for a statement. She had won, and yet as she looked around at the chaos, she realized something. Her life would never be the same. The victory was undeniable. Within days, the company issued a statement announcing sweeping changes to its hiring and promotion policies. They promised a new diversity and inclusion initiative, an independent oversight committee, and reparations for former employees who had been unfairly dismissed. It was a historic shift, one that wouldn't have happened without her fight. But the ripples extended beyond just one company. Several major corporations, fearful of similar lawsuits, began auditing their own hiring practices. Some quietly adjusted policies, others scrambled to appear proactive, launching diversity programs overnight. Then came something Charlotte never expected: congressional hearings. A group of lawmakers proposed a new federal bill aimed at preventing racial discrimination in corporate hiring and promotions. Advocacy groups pushed for stronger protections for whistleblowers like Charlotte, ensuring that future cases wouldn't require a person to sacrifice everything just to expose the truth. Charlotte wasn't just a former employee anymore. She had become a symbol. But victory came at a cost. Not everyone saw her as a hero. Social media was still a battlefield. She destroyed an entire company just because she was bitter. So what if they had some bias? That's how business works. She played the victim and got rich. Classic. Even in triumph, there were people who refused to believe her, who insisted she had exaggerated, that she had been out for revenge. She had changed the system, but she hadn't changed everyone. And then there was the personal cost. Charlotte knew she would never work in corporate HR again. Even though she had won, she had become a liability in the eyes of employers. No company wanted to hire the woman who had taken down a Fortune 500 firm. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had fought for equal opportunity, only to find every door closed to her. But she had expected that. She had prepared for it, and she had no regrets. James Foster called her a few days after the verdict. "I'm leaving my job," he said. Charlotte raised an eyebrow, holding the phone against her ear as she stared out of her apartment window. "You? Walking away from law enforcement?" James chuckled. "Not exactly. I'm joining a civil rights organization. They investigate corporate misconduct. Help people like you get justice?" She smiled. "That sounds like a better use of your skills." "Maybe. But I wouldn't have done it if it weren't for you," he admitted. "Watching you fight, watching you win, it made me realize I don't want to spend my career protecting the powerful." Charlotte's chest tightened at his words. She had fought this battle because she had to, but if it inspired others to stand up, that made it worth it. A week later, she received an envelope in the mail. No return address, no markings. Inside was a single piece of paper. "This is just the beginning. Be careful." Charlotte's fingers tightened around the page, a chill running down her spine. She should have been afraid. A warning like this meant that despite everything, there were still people who wanted her silenced. But instead of fear, she felt something else. Determination. She had faced worse, and she wasn't done yet. As she folded the letter and placed it in her desk drawer, Charlotte took a deep breath. She had shaken a system built to protect the powerful and suppress the truth. But systems don't break easily, and they never go down without a fight. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. 3 months had passed since the verdict, but peace remained elusive for Charlotte. She had expected some level of controversy. No one takes down a corporation without consequences. But what she hadn't expected was how divided the world remained about what she had done. Some people hailed her as a hero, a woman who had risked everything to expose the truth. Others saw her as a troublemaker, someone who had destroyed a company over policies that, in their eyes, were just part of business. Even now, news outlets continued to argue about whether the lawsuit had gone too far. Charlotte didn't care about the noise. What did concern her, however, was that the fight wasn't over. The company wasn't done yet. Despite the devastating blow of the trial, Bridgewell and Company filed an appeal, hoping to reduce the financial damages and shift the narrative in their favor. Their former CEO, Callaway, who had all but disappeared after the trial, suddenly resurfaced on primetime television. Sitting across from a well-known conservative host, he painted himself as the real victim. "This wasn't justice," Callaway claimed, his voice steady, rehearsed. "This was a coordinated attack on a successful American business. And if we allow this to happen, where does it stop? Who's next?" Charlotte sat on her couch watching the interview, her hands tightening around the armrest. She had anticipated retaliation, but watching him rewrite history so brazenly still made her blood boil. And it wasn't just Callaway. Several politicians began using her case as a rallying cry, arguing that the lawsuit had set a dangerous precedent for businesses. "This is why companies are hesitant to hire these days," one senator said during a televised debate. "If you make one mistake, suddenly you're in court being forced to pay millions." Charlotte scoffed. One mistake? This wasn't about a simple oversight. This was about decades of deliberate exclusion, policies designed to keep power in the hands of the same people while keeping others locked out. But as she listened, she realized something. They weren't just trying to fight back. They were trying to make sure no one else ever did what she did. They wanted to make an example of her. One evening, she met Olivia and James for dinner. It was the first time in months that they weren't meeting in a law office or a courtroom. James leaned forward, setting down his glass. "So, what's next for you?" Charlotte hesitated. "I don't know yet." Olivia gave her a knowing look. "That's not true. You're just afraid to say it out loud." Charlotte sighed, running a hand through her hair. The truth was, she had options. Olivia had introduced her to a nonprofit that focused on workplace equality, pushing for real legislative change. They wanted her on board. James had also reached out, saying that he was working on a broader investigation into other companies engaging in similar discrimination. He wanted her help, but she was tired. For years, her life had been consumed by this fight. And now, for the first time in what felt like forever, she wondered, did she have the energy to keep going? That question stayed with her for days, until she received an email that changed everything. It was from a young woman named Tanya Green. The subject line read, "Thank you." Charlotte clicked it open and began reading. "I just wanted to say thank you. I've been struggling at my job for years, feeling like I didn't belong, like I was stuck in a system designed to keep me from moving up. And when I saw what they did to you, I felt hopeless, like speaking up would only ruin me. But then you won, and now I know I'm not alone." Charlotte sat back in her chair staring at the screen. The noise, the attacks, the threats, none of it mattered. This was what she had fought for, and this was why she couldn't stop now. Taking a deep breath, she picked up her phone and called Olivia. "Tell me more about that nonprofit," she said. "I think I'm ready." The conference hall was packed. Rows of seats stretched out in every direction, filled with people from all walks of life. Activists, business leaders, students, journalists, and policymakers. Some were there to support her, others out of curiosity, and a few simply to see what came next. Charlotte stood backstage adjusting the microphone clipped to her blazer. A year had passed since the trial, but it still felt surreal that she was here. Not as an employee, not as a whistleblower in hiding, but as a leader in the fight for justice. She took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The audience rose to their feet, applause echoing across the hall. She had spoken at many events over the past year, but this felt different. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something bigger. A lot had changed since the trial. New policies were being proposed. Following the fallout from her lawsuit, several major corporations in the tech and finance industries had started independent diversity audits, attempting to ensure that what happened at Bridgewell and Company wouldn't happen elsewhere. Some of them did it out of genuine concern. Most did it out of fear. And that was fine with Charlotte. Change was change, no matter what forced it. The Equal Opportunity Advancement Act, a bill inspired in part by her case, was currently being debated in Congress. If passed, it would introduce stricter penalties for companies found guilty of systematic discrimination and provide greater protections for whistleblowers. Charlotte had testified before a House subcommittee just months earlier, sharing her experience and pushing for reforms. And she wasn't alone. More people were speaking up. After her trial, other former employees of Bridgewell and Company had come forward with their own stories. But it wasn't just Bridgewell. Her case had emboldened others. Across the country, workers from different industries started filing their own lawsuits, exposing discriminatory practices that had been swept under the rug for decades. She had started something, and it wasn't slowing down. But not everything had changed. Charlotte still received threats, some subtle, some overt. Emails, anonymous letters, whispers that she had made powerful enemies. Some claimed she had crippled an industry. Others said she had ruined lives, as if the people who lost their jobs were the victims, rather than the ones who had been discriminated against for years. She had learned to live with it, because she knew she wasn't fighting alone. Organizations had rallied around her cause. Companies that once ignored these issues were now forced to acknowledge them. And most importantly, people who had once been afraid were finally finding their voices. That was worth the risk. Charlotte looked out into the crowd, the energy in the room palpable. She picked up the microphone, letting the applause settle. Then she spoke. Justice doesn't come to us. She let the words hang in the air for a moment. We have to stand up and take it. The room was silent, but she could feel them listening. This fight isn't over, not for me, not for any of us. Because for every company that gets exposed, for every executive that's held accountable, there are dozens more who think they can still get away with it. She scanned the audience, her gaze sharp and unwavering. They're counting on us to get tired, to give up, to move on. She paused, gripping the microphone a little tighter. But we're not going anywhere. The applause was deafening. As she stepped down from the stage, Charlotte felt a sense of clarity. This wasn't the end of her journey. It was only the beginning. She walked through the crowd, shaking hands, exchanging words of encouragement. Faces blurred together, some familiar, others new. But then she saw someone standing at the back of the room. A man dressed in a dark suit watching her closely, not clapping, not smiling, just watching. Charlotte's chest tightened for a split second, but she didn't look away. Was he a supporter, or was he something else? She didn't know. But one thing was certain, her fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Justice isn't something handed down freely. It's something fought for, demanded, and defended. Charlotte's journey wasn't just about winning a lawsuit. It was about exposing a system designed to silence people like her. Her story reminds us that real change doesn't come easily. It requires courage, resilience, and a willingness to stand even when the odds are stacked against you. But here's the question. If Charlotte hadn't spoken up, how many more people would have suffered in silence? Now we want to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed injustice in the workplace? Do you think corporate accountability is improving, or is it still just beginning? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, stories about power, justice, and the people who refuse to be silenced, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Because this is just the beginning, and you won't want to miss what's next.